social justice, then you're very welcome. Now, there are enrolment forms at, I think, on almost all the tables. If not, one of the committee will bring around. Peter, they're available? Up the front. Okay, so anyone that would like to become a member and become active in this movement, you are very, very welcome. So have a look for the forms and put your name down and we'll make you very, very welcome. In a world of celebrities and heroes, it is too easy to neglect the major contribution made by thousands of very ordinary people. Development people call them the little people of the world. Because in the long term, their achievements have brought peace, change and democratic justice. Got to be careful about that word democracy, because North Korea also call themselves a democracy. It's democracy with justice. For example, the madres of the missing in Argentina and El Salvador, the mothers and grandmothers of the missing, were extraordinary women who assembled at the gates of hell, confronting two of the most brutal dictatorships in the world, El Salvador and the dirty war in Argentina. No amount of guns, riot squad or jackboots could move them. At the height of the Great Irish Famine in 1849, 600 women, men and children braved a flooded gorge to demand food for the starving, only to be turned away by the Guardian, who was responsible for their well-being, because they had interrupted his feast at the high table. Most of the 600 then had to leave with empty bellies, and many of them fell dead by the roadside in the desolate Dulo Gorge just above the Great Connemara. However, their action shocked Ireland and brought change. The thousands of men and women and children who fought for their liberation in the base Christian communities and helped bring down the tyrannical Brazilian dictatorship of the 1960s also should not be forgotten. They are the forgotten rebels who risked all for a better world. While they may have lost the battle, they certainly won the victory. At Eureka too, there were many forgotten people who were invaluable in winning democracy for all in future Australia, us. Our guest speaker tonight has written an award-winning history of these champions, the women of Eureka. It's the first of her trilogy about democracy, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, and it's important because it breaks the silence about those courageous women like the madres from the Plaza de Moye and those other wonderful people, the little people that changed the world, because it breaks the silence. I grew up in the Lawler family. I knew nothing about the women of Eureka. Thank you, Claire. Clair Wright. Clair Wright is an historian, a broadcaster, and Associate Professor of History at La Trobe University. Clair's Forgotten Rebels of Eureka has won the 214 Stella Prize and the Nib Waverley Library Award for Literature. Clair's successes in radio and television are many and very well known, including her TV documentary Utopia that played on ABC television. Clair's latest book, You Daughters of Freedom, The Australians Who Won the Vote and Inspired the World. Claire, I love that title, Inspired the World. We need more people to inspire the world, particularly today. All about those wonderful women that fought for the vote. And copies of this book are available tonight. My wife said, give it a good plug because it is a wonderful book. And it certainly is. So if you're interested in democracy, if you're interested in the women's movement, the fair go for the women, then this is a must read, as we will talk later about Claire's new book. So have a think about buying a copy, and if you're good, Claire might even sign it for you. Tonight, Claire is going to speak about the forgotten rebels of Australian democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Clair Wright, who through the power of the word has reminded Australians about the importance of the Eureka Stockade. Claire.
Thank you for that wonderful opening and for an event that has already been lovely. It's great to be here tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of this land on which we are meeting, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also acknowledge that this land was stolen and that Aboriginal sovereignty was never ceded. So it's a great honour to be asked to give the address at tonight's Eureka Democracy Awards, and I thank the organising committee, particularly Eric Howard, for the opportunity to do so. I've been a guest at the Eureka's Children dinners on previous occasions when I did speak about my book, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. And as we've just heard, I've recently released this new book, You Daughters of Freedom, which is about how Australian women won historic voting rights in 1902 and then used their status as the most fully enfranchised women on the planet to fight for democratic progressivism on the international stage. And I guess that's the reason that I've been asked to speak tonight on the topic of the forgotten rebels of Australian democracy. Now, there's just one thing I want to make clear to you before I start, so that nobody comes up and taps me on the shoulder afterwards, which happens at most dinners that I go to, and talk about my new book. People want to tell me that, wasn't it New Zealand where women got the right to vote first? And I tell them that yes, it was. New Zealand was the first country in the world to get the right to vote in 1893. But Australia was the first country where women had full political equality with men. That means the right to vote and the right to stand for Parliament. There was nothing that distinguished white men and women from each other, and we were the only country in the world where that was the case. And I'll explain a bit more of that later on. So I'm tempted to start with a joke to win you all over, because that's what public speakers are supposed to do. So let's go with the old maxim about democracy. In democracy, it's your vote that counts. In feudalism, it's your count that votes. Boom, boom. Or what about a quote from a famous intellectual to show you how smart I actually am? So how about this one from George Bernard Shaw? Democracy substitutes election by the incompetent, many, for appointment by the corrupt. Now, of course, citing quotations these days actually says nothing about your intelligence, just your ability to use Google. But more seriously, I do actually like this quote from the playwright Tom Stoppard. It's not the voting that's democracy, it's the counting. And what it means to count is at the heart of my own research into Australia's democratic history and heritage. So what I'd like to do tonight is to demonstrate some of the links between my research into Eureka and my new book, for they now form the first two instalments of my democracy trilogy, and I'll talk a little bit later about what the third instalment is. And then I'll also talk a bit about how we remember the past and why who we remember and the way we remember them matters. Now, many of you will have read The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka or heard me speak about it before at one of these dinners, so I won't spend too much time retelling that story. But basically it recounts how a generation of risk-takers and dreamers came to Victoria during the gold rush, saddled with their hopes and expectations for a richer, freer life. Many of those hopes were dashed in Ballarat in 1854, crushed by poverty, petty tyranny, bureaucratic oppression, and because immigrants, being without property, didn't have the right to vote, the inability to address their grievances or change the conditions of their daily lives. And through primary evidence, I demonstrated just how many of those immigrants were women and children, and how the women of Eureka were just as full of expectation about their destiny, their entitlements, and the bright future that was supposed to be theirs as their menfolk. Now, these women directly challenged what they considered to be bad government policies and decisions. These were women like Anastasia Hayes, Ellen Young, Sarah Hanmer, Catherine Bentley, Eliza Darcy, and Clara Seacamp. And they made sure their grievances were heard and that their actions counted, even if their voice and activities were limited in formal political terms. And we know, and as we know, the legislative regime was changed after Eureka, and manhood suffrage won, even though the direct causal link is still being debated by historians. Some women and their male allies argued for womenhood suffrage at this time too. And though women and men fought shoulder to shoulder for their rights and liberties, women's rights were effectively thrown under the bus. And it would take another generation of rebellious women to win the female franchise. I think the emotional impact of the Eureka story is still best felt when standing next to its material legacy, the Eureka flag. I first viewed the flag in 2004, escorted by Anne Hall, the great-great-granddaughter of Anastasia Hayes. Some of you will remember Anne. The flag was then housed at the Art Gallery of Ballarat, and seeing the flag for the first time in its dark little lair literally brought tears to my eyes. Standing beside me, Anne wondered aloud which stitches her ancestor had sewn. And I'm just going to break from my actual formal speech to say for a minute, I had a similar experience when 5 years ago at the Eureka's children dinner, I sat next to Ella, who is Eliza Darcy's granddaughter. And if you want to ponder that fact, that's because Eliza Darcy and Patrick Howard had 15 children. And, sorry, how many? 14 children. There's another woman at Eureka who had 15. The wife of the Assistant Gold Commissioner, James Johnson, she had 15. And that is why, because of these large families, that Ella Hancock is still alive today at 102 to be able to tell her grandmother's stories from Eureka. So we're not talking ancient history here. So, standing beside me there, Anne wondered aloud which stitches her ancestor had sewn, and 5 years ago, at a dinner like this, Ella Hancock told me the stories that her grandmother told her about the flag at Eureka as well. Now, that flag not only represents individual courage, ingenuity and effort, but also a collective voice. It was designed to represent all the disenfranchised who gathered beneath it, for who the Southern Cross was the one uniting symbol, that constellation that they all looked up at every night. And what the flag said was this: we have come from all parts of the globe. We all have our own flags, our own languages, our own histories. But we are here now, and we count. We must count. And that flag was called the Australian flag. Again, if I can break off here just a moment, I'd like to briefly mention the television adaptation of The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka that's presently happening. Now, some of you will know the screen rights to the book were purchased by Ruby Entertainment, who produced much-loved Australian comedies like Kath and Kim and Fast Forward, and who more recently made the screen adaptation of Kate Grenville's wonderful historical novel, The Secret River. And we've been lucky enough to secure the Hollywood screenwriter Anne Kenny, who wrote and produced ER and LA Law and most recently Outlander. And she is writing the pilot episode for the proposed 10-part television series based on my book right now, as we speak, in Hollywood. and sends that draft pilot script to myself and Mark Roos, the producer at Ruby, and we do our backwards and forwards on it. Netflix have asked for first right of refusal to see it. So I mention this now because I think it's the very internationalism of the Eureka story. So we were just hearing about the Germans, and many of you in the room have ancestors who came from different parts of the world. It's the very internationalism of the Eureka story that is so appealing to these overseas writers and producers and potential investors. And it's been so interesting for me in developing the series with Anne Kenny to realise that she knew nothing about Australian history before reading my book. But she feels that she can relate to so many of its themes and its dramatic conundrums. Eureka is our story, our very Australian story. But in 1854, there wasn't such a thing as an Australian accent, as we've been talking about in terms of who to cast, or an Australian citizen, or an Australian national identity. Apart for the Wathaurong, who will be represented in the TV series, everyone came from somewhere else. And it's been very gratifying that people from all those somewhere else's are drawn to this story of flight and liberation and deliverance as well. So my new book is clearly an international story to begin with, because women's suffrage was an international rights movement. Indeed, 50 years after Eureka, women's suffrage was described by a contemporary as the great world movement, the most insistent political problem of the day, the most significant revolution that has come over society in the first years of the 20th century. Those are all primary quotes. The suffrage movement, or the cause as it was known, stood for rebellion, emancipation, spiritual renewal, and a fundamental change in the sexual, political, and industrial structure of society. Its insurgence is worldwide, wrote one contemporary commentator. And for this reason, I think the women's suffrage crusade will, in the eyes of the historian, overshadow all other events of these tumultuous times. How wrong he was. Votes for Women was what Kevin Rudd might have called the great moral challenge of the age. And the remarkable fact is that Australia led the world in finding a forward-thinking solution to that challenge. For in 1902, just 1 year after its inauguration, the new Australian Parliament passed legislation securing white women's rights to both vote and to stand for federal office. And this act, as I said, made Australian women the most fully enfranchised in the world. As one journalist in 1903 wrote, "The purest type of democracy the human race has ever known flourishes today beneath Australian skies." Now, of course, there's no avoiding the fact that all Indigenous Australians were disenfranchised by the very same Act of Parliament that secured women their historic rights. The Franchise Act of 1902 meant that race, not gender, became the precondition for inclusion in the body politic of white Australia. And few international onlookers batted an eye at this scenario, although there were a few members of that first Parliament who spoke out against the injustice. And I have to say that writing that chapter of my book about the passage of the 1902 Franchise Act was the most difficult, in some ways the most difficult chapter to write, because actually quoting Hansard and quoting the things that people had to say about Indigenous people at the time is very raw and gut-wrenching. But it's also inspiring to realise that there were people who were standing up for Indigenous rights at the time. And so it's this extraordinary situation that Australia was the proving ground for democratic idealism, the poison tester of the progressive world, offering proof of concept that women's suffrage could not only happen, but that it could work, that made Australian women the daughters of freedom, as one of the leading British suffragettes of the day wrote to Australia's most prominent suffragette, Vida Goldstein, in 1911. And just a little aside, Vida Goldstein was courted by John Monash, since we've raised his name tonight. She turned down his offers, as she turned down all offers of marriage. She never married or had children because she believed if she did, she wouldn't be able to work for the improvement and betterment of all women and children. And John Monash later wrote that he thought that she was a snob, but only after she turned him down. Australia truly was, in the decade and a half before 1914, what one contemporary called the envy of the world. Journalists and sociologists and political scientists travelled to Australia to observe what might happen in the unprecedented petri dish of political and legislative reform, the test site that would also pioneer the living wage, the first elected Labor government, and other socially progressive legislation like pure food laws, a maternity allowance and a widow's pension. And Australian men and women took their responsibilities as the social innovators of the world very seriously. Australia was, as the globe-trotting American journalist Jesse Ackerman put it, in the noonday glare. I like that because it makes it sound like a Western movie. So I got the idea for the book, You Daughters of Freedom, when I was standing in front of another spectacular material object made by an Australian woman. And this time I had no guide, no descendant like Anne Hall to help me interpret its literal and effective meaning. But I fell in love with the object the minute I stumbled upon it unexpectedly at Parliament House in Canberra. And these slides just show the journey to the object that I'm talking about. So here we are in Parliament House in Canberra, in the PM's gallery. If you just hit the next one, Adele. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. And there's me last summer standing in front of it. So this object is the women's suffrage banner. I'll get you to flip to the next one, Adele. Cheers. This object is the women's suffrage banner, created in the summer of 1908 by Australian expat artist Dora Meeson Coates in her Chelsea studio. Now, Melbourne-born Dora was among the band of Australian artists, including Tom Roberts and Will Dyson and Ruby Lindsay, who made their home in London in the first decades of the 20th century. By 1908, Dora had joined the Women's Freedom League, which, along with other suffrage societies, organised the first monster street demonstrations, a march through central London attended by tens of thousands of supporters and watched by hundreds of thousands of curious onlookers. And Dora's banner represented Australian women living in London, women who, so in the march, this is what the Australian women living in London walked behind Dora's banner. And these Australian women, unlike their less fortunate British sisters, which is how they referred to them, these women got representation for their taxation. And Dora used the banner again in the even bigger women's coronation procession of 1911. So you can see it here, but I'll describe to you what those Londoners could see and what today's visitors at Parliament House can see. And I should say that what was unique among the 1,000 banners carried in that procession in 1911, that all the other suffrage banners were sewn or embroidered, and this one alone was painted oil upon hessian. If you could flip to the next one, you'll see. And keep going, because it's, I think, or maybe it'll reveal itself. Anyway, yeah, you'll see the oil on the hessian. So, as you can see, it's massive. The banner's 2.5 metres high and 1.5 metres wide, and it took 4 bearers to stagger under its weight in the 1911 procession. If you want to go to the next one. So what we've got here is Mother Britannia, draped in white, holding her sceptre, her hip and her head cocked, staring into the middle distance. And daughter Minerva, bearing a shield, with the heraldry of the Australian Federation, leaning forward, reaching out and offering advice. And written across the top in red are the words Commonwealth of Australia, and below it, in these shouty all caps and quotation marks, the words that Australia speaks to England. Trust the women, Mother, as I have done. As you can see, it's a banner replete with allegorical effrontery, signifying that which all the world knew. That, as one European suffrage leader put it, it was impossible to think of that far-off future when the world's women would vote without bringing to mind an antipodial empire, that island continent, our best beloved suffrage achievement, Australia. And the banner articulated what one woman who was living in London described as the fact of our having proved to the world our political fitness, a fine object lesson. Remember those words, proved to the world. In 1908 and 1911, all the world might have known how far in advance Australia was. But standing in front of the banner that first time, I had to ask myself an uncomfortable question. Why didn't I know about this material object? I'm a feminist historian, for God's sake. A work of political art that was obviously important enough to display in the big house of Australian democracy. Why don't all Australians know about this work? It was a shock to me that I knew more about the making of the American flag than I knew about this Australian treasure. And as I would come to discover over the course of my subsequent research, Dora Meeson-Coates' banner was just one of the means by which Australian women in London drew attention to themselves and their status as voters in order to convince the British Parliament of the wisdom and the justice of its own homegrown demand for the female franchise. And my book tracks the individual feats and fortunes, the highs and the lows, of 5 remarkable Australians who all fought for the British suffragettes. Vida Goldstein and Dora Meeson-Coates, as I've mentioned, but also Dora Montefiore, Nellie Martell and Muriel Matters. And unfortunately I haven't got time to tell you about all of them tonight, but if I may, I'm just going to recall one of the escapades of one of them, and that's Dora Montefiore. So I think if you go to the next slide, we'll have that. All right. Now, I'm not going to tell you this story, but that is Dora Montefiore up there at her window in Hammersmith in London, where she held a siege in her home, holding out against paying her tax for 6 weeks, and refusing to let the bailiffs come in and collect the goods that they were entitled to seize from her to pay her tax bill. And her argument was that if she wasn't getting any representation, why should she pay her taxation? So let's hear in Dora's words why, after she set up the first suffrage society in New South Wales in 1891, she devoted her considerable energies for the most of the rest of her life, although she did come backwards and forwards to Australia, to the British cause. In Australia, Dora argued, a woman can give her vote, but here in England, voting is denied her. I am ranked with convicts, children and lunatics. And that is the difference between England and Australia. So Dora pulled many stunts, including this one, which was known as the Siege of Hammersmith. But she was also the brainchild of a more famous campaign of civil disobedience, staged on British Census Day in 1911, just 2 months before that women's coronation procession. And on this day, thousands of women across Great Britain refused to pay the government the bureaucratic respect of filling out their census forms. Women are not citizens, argued Dora. Why, therefore, should we fulfil any obligations of citizenship? And this logic caught on, and it became a nationwide boycott. If women didn't count, the reasoning went, well, they would make it literally impossible to be counted. And the census boycott was a highly orchestrated campaign backed by all the major suffrage associations, including the Women's Freedom League and Emmeline Pankhurst's WSPU, which is the most famous of the suffragette organisations. And on census night, you can click to the next one. Oh, this is the Women's Resistance League that Dora set up after her siege. Oh no, go one more, that one. So on census night, there were mass evacuations of suffragettes and their male supporters from their homes. They staged anti-census dances and smoking concerts and card games and ice skating parties and nocturnal picnics in London parks. Rich benefactors offered their mansions as the refuge for up to 50, 100, 150 refuseniks to have these mass sleepovers. Census evaders could be found wandering the streets at 2 a.m, singing protest songs and otherwise skylarking. And others who couldn't leave their homes dodged the census by writing slogans on their forms. No vote, no census. It was a kind of, and no persons here, only women. It was a kind of donkey census return. Now the government, which I should say was Herbert Asquith's Liberal government, whose policy or slogan was trust the people, and these were not the Tories, these were the Liberals. The government predictably played down the effect of the boycott, but for the suffragettes it was a win. There was saturation media coverage and there were no prosecutions for disturbing the peace. No one went to jail, which was significant because by 1911 over 750 suffragettes had been imprisoned, including Australians Dora Montefiore and Nellie Martell. And Emmeline Pankhurst probably summed up the most concrete outcome of the census resistance. She said, "The resistors had a very good time." And it's a telling line, I think, as one suffragette described the feeling of being part of this movement. "We were free and alone in a great, brilliant city. Scores of young women, scarcely out of their teens, met together in a revolutionary movement. Outlaws or breakers of laws, independent of everything and everybody, fearless and self-confident." And I think if you substitute the Victorian frontier for great, brilliant city, she could have been describing the women of Eureka. Now the irony is that the British suffragettes have become icons, international icons of female resistance and protest to generations of women. And the recent Hollywood blockbuster starring Meryl Streep as Emmeline Pankhurst brought a new global audience to this singular moment in British history. While here in Australia, the Eureka miners, until recently conceived as exclusively male, as we've heard, and bushrangers like Ned Kelly have become icons of anti-authoritarianism and reckless bravado to generations of wannabe rebels in Australia. But Australian political activists who were global media sensations and folk heroes a century ago, women like Dora Montefiore and Muriel Matters. Here's Muriel flying her Votes for Women airship across the top of Westminster in 1909, Adelaide-born girl who was known the world over as that daring Australian girl. Women like Dora and Muriel Matters are relegated to footnotes of academic history if considered at all. So I want to ask, why does any of this matter? Because the stories we tell about ourselves matter. If they didn't, governments wouldn't invest millions of dollars in telling certain stories and not others. Television networks wouldn't have local content quotas. Publishing companies wouldn't have protected markets. The people we hold up as role models matter. If they didn't, we wouldn't name streets and universities and electorates after them. We wouldn't build statues and memorials to them, and we wouldn't bother to tear them down. And asking questions matters. Questions that no algorithm can answer. Questions like, what does it mean to count? To count for nothing. To stand up and be counted. Politically, constitutionally, and culturally. And these are the questions that both the Eureka flag and the women's suffrage banner address. And they are fundamental questions that lead inexorably to the third instalment of my